back, Kathy.
Well, thanks.
We're here for the fourth of our sessions on breath work and how they relate to grief, specifically the kinds of intense, complex, complicated grief that the survivors we support deal with. Because I think it's very common that when you're dealing with survival of a loss to a death of despair, suicide, or substance abuse, that the complexities include all kinds of very, very strong emotions that can kind of become blocking factors to stop people from moving forward. And so, of course, those can include anger, shame, guilt, regret, all of which are very natural. I think, the first important message to get across is that it's normal in these very tough and tragic losses to feel those complex emotions, but they can stop you. You can get so caught up in those feelings, those emotions, that you're not able to effectively mourn. You're not able to move forward. So let's take them on one at a time, because they are different. They affect us in different ways, and I find that anger is sometimes it's the emotion that people struggle with giving themselves permission to feel the most. They feel like, ironically, they feel guilty because they feel anger. And yet, I think the most important thing is to recognize that it's just how you feel. It is a natural part of that. But we need to find some way to release that energy, because it is such a volatile feeling, and it can be overwhelming.
The hardest part with anger, for people to understand, is that it is normal. And it is acceptable as long as violence hasn't hurt anybody else.
Right.
Anger in the realm of the hierarchy of emotions, anger is an actual upgrade from depression. It's a stepping out. It's an action ability to do something somehow, even if it doesn't feel right. And our society doesn't allow for that.
No.
It doesn't have any room for that. And it doesn't have any permission for any of that. So anger has to be understood that I'm allowed to be angry. I'm allowed to have these emotions, and I don't necessarily know what to do with them and how to work with them. Anger is of all of them. Anger is the most outward of the four that we're speaking of today, and it actually is a lead up to anything else. So if you can take anger and the word of anger and move it into a place of ambivalence, let's say, or of a moment of quiet for just to give a break, or use it as a motivating tool to teach, or a motivating tool to breathe, or a motivating tool to just give yourself the permission to have a discipline. That's great for people that have the anger as the thing, finding that discipline in that way. And that's why things like journaling are so great for anger, because that's a discipline and a promise every day. I'm going to do this thing, and I'm going to help that to release. Exercise is great for that.
Sure. And it's interesting, I think, in journaling, or if you've got an effective companioning relationship, you've got a safe space to air your anger out, to articulate it. And there's something about that takes the power out of it. In part, maybe because, when fully expressed, it becomes obvious that it's not really how you feel. It's not, there are really many other emotions going on behind that. And to recognize that it's just a natural part of the process you're going through.
Yeah, and to give it permission. Just, not the violence. It feels like it's violent, but it's actually just an expression to get enough power underneath it that you're not in a cave and eyes closed and curled up in a ball.
Yeah. And perhaps even just, a need to reassert control over something, to be able to vent.
And this is one of those where the breath of fire that was discussed in an earlier podcast may be really valuable in this one. It's one of those things that you meet fire with fire.
Yeah.
And that breath to just to remember is a powerful exhaling through the nose, and letting the
panting kind of
the
technique.
Panting one. Start with the pant. Close that mouth and keep it going. That kind of breath with the nose. Well, and then if you power up your gut, it's an action of your gut. It's a re-regulation of your autonomic nervous system.
Yeah,
it does wonders.
I've heard anger described as an explosive emotion, which probably makes it easier to see pairing that with the breath of fire.
It does. Fire with fire.
Light the fuse.
Fire with fire.
But I can see that that breath of fire pulls in so much energy that I could see that it could sort of overwhelm that feeling of anger and allow it to dissipate somewhat.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
Is that it meets it and it gives a more appropriate hormonal balance than the anger itself.
Right.
Without any pause would give.
Yeah, because of course we get that pineal gland action again. So one of the aspects of the losses that we talk about is that they tend to be stigmatized, and so it is very common for survivors of these losses to feel shame, and by that I don't mean that they're ashamed of the loved one that they lost in this horrible way. They're ashamed of themselves. They're ashamed that somehow they weren't a good enough person, a good enough parent, a good enough friend to be able to have made a difference. And it's again natural to feel that way, but it sort of presumes more control than is realistic over other people's choices and lifestyles.
Right.
Even our children.
Shame works on the human by just knocking out the whole self-worth. It's the whole world is my fault, and if I had done better, if I could have done woulda, shoulda, coulda in that way. I think shame is one of the more detrimental to the brain. Shame actually stunts the ability of the hippocampus from learning new information. So shame is a very difficult one, and it's one of the most important ones to recognize and say, yes, is that really me, or is that a feeling I have right now?
Right.
And it's a hard one. It's interesting that we're using this one right after anger, because in relationships sometimes you have the one that's angry, and then you have the one that's shameful, and the anger one just gets angrier because it really hasn't been addressed, and the shameful feeling one takes it all on,
right,
and never gets better either. It's an interesting mix of
goes
those
deeper
two.
Into shame,
and it's difficult to understand. So both sides of whoever has what, and every individual does it differently. So there's no cookbook in this thing, but understanding that that's fair, but this is fair, and I'm feeling these shameful feelings, and I need to be able to go within and realize, is it really me, or is it my grief?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the healing comes in that. And it's also a place where doing some things that work for your body can help you have the endurance to get through that process of shame. So breathing helps with that, because if you can say, okay, I have control over this, I didn't have control over that, and I still have me. And I still have my own self-worth, because I don't have to lose all of that every time that I have to think about this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Shame is such a tough emotion to get past, especially with these stigmatized losses, because there's so much potential for feedback that reinforces that feeling of shame. And yet, I think very much like anger, if we can create a scenario where we can fully express it, acknowledge that it's natural to feel that way, that it's natural for you, but if we can fully express it, air it out, expose it to sunlight. Sunlight's the best disinfectant. We can realize that, there really isn't a good basis for that feeling. It's just how we feel.
And it's interesting about shame as its relationship to the hippocampus, because hippocampus has to do with new thought. And if our hippocampus isn't working correctly, it is part of what leads to dementia and Alzheimer's, actually. So if we can imagine that this would be a time, even if it's just in a structure that says, I don't deserve it, but I'm doing it anyway, to learn something new.
Yeah.
This is a time to start some kind of an art project. Never did that before.
Right.
Something that you've never seen before. Go to a place you've never been. Learn a new idea or new language or a new thought, and say, I'm gonna play with this right now, and I'm gonna make that my discipline, because that then allows the hippocampus to take a break here, so it's not being shut down entirely through this process of shame as you get through. And it helps worth. It's helping worth.
Yeah, I can see that. It would give you something to feel good about yourself about. And so from a breathing context, I'm guessing this emotion would be something that might benefit from that sort of basic 4-stage count of 4 simple breathing pattern.
It would make sense to do that. It would also make sense in this case that maybe look at what whole yoga is about, or maybe take a class, or maybe do some Tai Chi, something that explores more than one kind. This is a place where meditation lets you be still and say, okay, I need to think differently than I did before.
Yeah. So I think closely related to feelings of shame are feelings of guilt. And I can speak from personal experience. I think we learn to be very good at manufacturing guilt out of almost nothing. And yet it's a very real part of many people's grief journeys. And so it in some ways also relates to regret, right? Because you get caught up in the woulda, coulda, shoulda stuff. If onlys, the if onlys can consume you. And in a way, it has some similarities with shame in that it's sort of the only way to justify feeling that way is presuming that you have more control than you possibly could have had.
Sure.
So, how does guilt differ from shame?
Guilt. That's very interesting. They're very rolled into each other. But guilt is more about this episode was my fault rather than I am my fault.
Right.
Shame is I am at fault. And guilt is if I had been different, if I had said this, if I had done that, it would have made a difference. And that's almost more closely to regret in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shame is sort of a standalone, really hard to get to self-worth issue. But guilt has a lot to say about our ability to process what we knew at our core. We've learned guilt from age 2 on. I'm pretty sure everybody knows that story one way or another. Guilt is the way that religions have controlled in the past, and not always and not all the time, but it's a way to get the people and the family and the culture and everybody to hang on and follow suit. And so we find guilt as I thought I did right, and I didn't follow suit. I didn't do the right thing.
Right.
And it's an outside story. So the way to work with that in the breath is to remember that all we have in control is our breath. That's it. And we just don't have anything but the ability to control our breath in the end. And we have the ability to live in peace without having to always answer to everybody else's ideas. And I think that starts to help us a little bit because we learned it so young.
Yeah.
It's a fallback.
Now, of course, there are times when guilt is a legitimate response. When somebody knowingly did something or failed to do something, they caused harm. And yet, even in those circumstances, it's important to find some way to move beyond that. And, I think that mechanism is rightly something like self-forgiveness,
Right.
very tough thing for many of us to do, is to actually actively, outwardly, overtly forgive ourselves for our failings, real or imagined, and to just accept that sometimes, even if we did the best we could, it wasn't enough.
And it wasn't our responsibility in the first place.
Right.
And I think we take on an awful lot in the name of guilt, for culture and all that we do. And I think sometimes the answers can be found in moments of music or sound vibrations or humming or singing or any kind of feelings that help bring our connection back to ourselves.
Yeah. And so that also leads us then into the concept of regret, which, like guilt, is very backward looking in our lives, right? It's trying to replay history and really is all about the woulda, coulda, shouldas, and if onlys that can consume us. But how does regret differ?
I think regret's a little deeper feeling in that way. Regret is like I totally messed this one up. It's almost a bigger, more global picture of it all the things that I was supposed to do I didn't do. Where I think sometimes guilt is that I could have done something more emotionally supportive. This one is like I totally messed that one up. But I think in regret is a place where you can stand back and you can just appreciate it is historic. It is our past at this point, and it is something that we can look at through hindsight without looking at it as a current event.
Yeah. So I refer to all of these four as blocking emotions because they're like if we always use the metaphor of a journey for the process of surviving our grief, and they're like the roadblocks. There's something that it's not something to feel. It's not yet another thing to feel guilty about because you have these emotions. Of course, it's important to recognize that they're very natural, but they need to be dealt with.
Right, and I don't actually know that they're real roadblocks on their own right. I mean, they're not as much roadblocks and stops as awarenesses.
Yeah.
And if we know them, if we can look at them and evaluate them almost from the outside in a little bit and just kind of look at them as a processing, we can go, okay, yeah, I can understand that, and maybe I can develop a new tool that'll help me do something different.
Yeah.
And maybe I can see it as a process that's expected. I'm supposed to see that in one way or another, and not everybody's going to be angry, but maybe they should. Maybe they should be beating a pillow right now.
Right.
And then maybe they have feelings of guilt. Okay, let me have that. Let me bring that one on and work through it at almost like a stage. Let me have that.
Yeah.
Let me have this shame for a minute and see, is that really true? Is it really true?
Yeah.
Or is that something that is important for me to kind of work through and make sure that I am whole? And then remember that you're whole in the beginning. You're in the whole in the beginning, you're whole in the middle, and you're whole in the end.
Right.
You still have a spark of God.
Yes. And so it's so interesting. I look at this grief journey really as a path to getting back to a place of hope that there can be meaning and purpose in your life. And part of that is to find those better parts of you. Mm-hmm. And that for me is an opening for things like breath work, because it's an investment in yourself. It's it's self-validating. Yep. It's a growth kind of thing. I think it's very powerful for all of these emotions. And as you said earlier, perhaps in the case of anger, there's a different breathing technique that's most appropriate, and for the others, I don't know. Would you say that it's that sort of more standard 4-step breathing process that's most appropriate?
I think it starts there. I think in shame, as I understand it, learning new things. So maybe take a yoga class and teaches you some new stuff.
Uh,
And in guilt, it's like, yeah, I see that. Let me put it on the shelf and let me just do some self-care. If I can just kind of give myself the self-care, then I can begin to trust again. And
Right.
it starts with me.
yeah.
And then with regret, it's a story that has a timeline, and let me see what the timeline can look like from this moment forward.
Yeah. To be able to release the past and start to look to the future.
And so that works on a breath of meditation. Say, what do I want? What is it?
Yeah.
What is it now?
Yeah, and I can see that, breath work could easily be the lead into a meditation practice for all of these things. It allows you to kind of air them out, release the energy that goes with that, and sort of open the door for how you move beyond it.
And a slight reset every time. Every time you choose to stop and breathe, you get a chance to reset.
Yeah.
Just a little.
Yeah.
That's all we ask.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge about these very difficult emotions. They're very powerful and yet natural. And so we need to be able to understand what we're going through, to be able to move beyond that, even knowing that they'll come back, they'll revisit us, but each time we're a little better equipped to deal with those feelings.
And each time we have one of those four or more than that, there's many more than the four we've chosen, to give the permission to the partner that you're with, or whoever, your children, your family, that you give them permission to have theirs.
Yeah.
And you understand that this is what I'm working through. It's not supposed to be shut down. It's supposed to be explored.
It has to be.
explored.
So that's really a beautiful point, because it allows us to be better companions for others who are sharing our grief, and also opens a possibility that they companion us.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you, Kathy.
You're welcome.
We'll be back for another session.
See you again.